Well, we lived in Wichita Falls back during those days, but in the meantime, my father had bought a ranch outside of Texas, which was a mile and a half. It was part of the old original XIT ranch, which was the ranch that the state of Texas had sold to the Chicago syndicate to build the state capitol. And it was 3 million acres of ranch land. And the ranch that Daddy bought was a mile and a half from a place called Buffalo Springs, which were the original headquarters of the XIT ranch. Well, it was so hot in the summertime in Wichita Falls that Mother would pack up everybody, Daddy would pack up Mother and all the kids and drive us to that ranch to spend the summer because it was just delightful. But it had to be very hard on my mother because there were no electric lights, there was no plumbing. We had an outdoor privy, and she cooked on a great big coal stove, and she bathed us about once a week in this great big galvanized tub. Now she washed her feet every night before we went to bed. But here she was stuck out in the country 17 miles from Texas, and there wasn't anything in Texas when you got there. Working ranch, and we had 12 cowboys, and there were 3 big houses on that ranch, and we lived in one of the smaller houses until we moved to the big house and stayed in the big house in the summertime from then on. It was a big 2-story house. And but my mother, I can remember, she did the washing. She had a great big iron kettle out in the backyard with an open fire under it. And she'd put the sheets and things in there and stir them up with a stick and then hang them out on the line. And then she ironed with an old flat iron that she heated up on that cold stove. And you really had to be careful with that iron or you'd scorch everything or you could burn yourself. And another thing that she did that I remember was that she made fresh cottage cheese. And she'd put the raw milk out on the back porch and cover it up with a tea towel, and by the morning it would be clabber, and she would take the cream off of it to make butter, and then she would put the rest of it in sugar sacks and hang it out on the line, and it would drip, the whey would drip out of it, and she would have wonderful homemade cottage cheese. But I remember that part of my job when I was little was to churn. And we had a big crock churn, about 2 feet high, with a stick in the middle of it. And I'd push that stick up and back and up and down and up and down and up and down until the butter would come. Then Mother would skim the butter off, and then we would have this wonderful, wonderful homemade buttermilk. And strangely enough, I was not allergic to the buttermilk. I remained allergic to sweet milk, but I could drink the buttermilk. And another one of my jobs every day was to clean the lamp wicks from our coal oil lamps. And of course, the lamp shades would be covered with soot every morning, and that was part of my job, was to clean those. And I remember she also taught me how to cross-stitch. And we had big flour sacks that were washed and bleached out, and they made wonderful tea towels. And she would go in and buy patterns of cross-stitching, and I would cross-stitch patterns on those. And another thing I did was paper dolls. Oh, I loved to play paper dolls. And we had, out in the privies, we had Sears Roebuck catalogs and Montgomery Ward catalogs, but we could also use those for paper dolls, and we'd cut out the furniture, and that was one of the things that kept me busy. And strangely enough, I don't ever remember playing with my sister. She was an artist, and she did other things, but I never did play with her. And my older brother hung out with the cowboys. They taught him how to drive when he was 7 years old, and also taught him how to smoke when he was 7 years old. But We also had a big old horse, an old mare called Baldy. And my sister did ride with us on that horse, and we'd get on old Baldy, the old mare, and ride around the house. And there was a big apple tree that had a low limb, and that horse would insist on going under that low limb, and when she'd wipe us all off, we'd fall off her rear end and hit the ground, and she'd stand there until we all got on, and then she'd start around the house again, and she'd come around and go under that apple tree and wipe us all off. Well, we had some really scary things happen. As I say, we were out in the country with, one time my brother, who was a toddler, got in a red ant bed, and they just stung him he was just one red ant bite, one bad bite all over it. I'll never forget that little thing's screaming all night long because, of course, he was in terrible pain. And then another time, while he was still a toddler, my mother had put out saucers of water that had black paper to kill the flies, which was arsenic. And the child got a hold of one of those and drank it. And he began to turn blue, and she saw him just as he drank that, and she knew that she had to get something down him to make him throw that up. So Daddy happened to be visiting up there. He'd come up on the weekends, and she handed this egg to Daddy, and she said, "Crack and separate this egg." Well, Daddy, being a man and a lawyer, didn't know how to crack and separate an egg. He just stood there with that in his hand and said, "How do you crack and separate an egg?" And I remember she tossed the baby to him, and she said, "Here, let me do it." And she got it down him and saved his life. And then one day she came in, we'd been into Texas line for something, and a big hailstorm hit. Well, we had to park the car about a block from the house. Well, she dropped us off. The hail had not hit yet, but we knew they were going to get a big storm. She said, "You all run in the house while I go put this car up." And she put it up, and before she got back, the hail started to fall. And they were big as golf balls and some as big as baseballs. And when it was all over, she just barely got back to the house because if she'd been hit with one of them, it would have killed her. We had about a foot of that heavy hail, and it killed all the chickens and all the turkeys. It killed all the livestock, not the livestock, but everything around that in that area was killed by that hail. And I'm sure that those summers were terribly hard on my mother, but I never heard her complain. Yeah. And Daddy would come up on the Fort Worth and Denver from Wichita Falls, and we would go in on a Saturday night to meet him. Well, if we got in earlier enough, we'd go over to Clayton and go to the City Drug and get what we called a Green River, which was a predecessor of Kool-Aid. Mm. Only it was just, I'm sure, sugar water with green coloring in it, and was probably awful, but we thought it was just wonderful. And then we would come back, we'd pick up Daddy, and sometimes we would eat at the railroad hotel there, because that was a section part for the Fort Worth and Denver, before we went on back out to the ranch. Wichita Falls, we'd drive from Wichita Falls, and back in those days, it took 2 days to drive from Wichita Falls to the ranch at Texas line. And we stopped someplace. I cannot remember where we stopped on the way up here. It had to be Childress or Clarendon or someplace like that. But we always tried to get to Amarillo in the middle of the morning so we could go down to the Palace of Sweets and have something that was a sweet shop owned by the people who were the local Greek people. Helen Botsona's father owned that store, and we'd stop there. And but it took 2 days.
So she would drive the car up so that there would be a vehicle.
Yes, and then Daddy would take the train back to Wichita Falls. And he had to stay in Wichita Falls, but he would come up several times during the summer. He had to stay in Wichita Falls and practice take care of his business. But then toward the end of the summer, we always, with the other local ranchers, we had a big roundup, which was exciting, and we had a big chuck wagon, and I'd like to know what happened to that big chuck wagon, because people don't know that Charles Goodnight was the one who developed the chuck wagons for his cattle drives. And if he had held on to them, he might have made some money out of them, but he sold them to Studebaker, who manufactured the chuck wagons.